Welcome to another edition of Ebenezer Reformed Church's online Sunday school class. We're continuing to look at the question of apostolic examples or epistolary examples, to use the title we have been using, where we consider what we can learn from the authors of the New Testament epistles when we step back from just the words that they say, and we consider them as concrete individuals who are addressing particular situations, and by the very fact of doing so, are providing us an example. And when we come to 2 Corinthians, which is where we've been for a couple of weeks, what we're particularly seeing is the example that the Apostle Paul gives us of interacting with other Christians when there's a certain amount of conflict, a certain amount of hostility, a certain amount of mistrust or tension between you. And last week we were considering that Paul does not allow the reality of tension to bring him to reduce the Corinthians to just his opponents, at the same time that they are against him in some meaningful ways, at the same time that he has to defend himself from attacks against him. He also continues to consider them as partners, as collaborators with him for the sake of the gospel. And so not only does he continue to teach them doctrine, but he also addresses them about the question of taking up a special collection for the saints at Jerusalem who were suffering because of poverty and famine. Now, that brought us to 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and there's so many things to explore, so many things to talk about, that we kind of had to stop a little bit. I ran on too long and wound up having to chop off a few minutes and end rather more abruptly than usual with a title card last week. So I'd like to return to 2 Corinthians chapter 7 today and see if we can't get into things in a little bit more depth and detail than we had the opportunity to do in the last session. Now, you might remember the setting of 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul had dispatched a forceful letter to the Corinthian church, and of course many commentators believe, and it makes a lot of sense, that that would have been 1 Corinthians. Then, of course, given the communications of the time, he had to wait. And during that waiting, he was experiencing a considerable amount of anxiety or of distress. He was continuing with his missionary labors. He was working and traveling. He arrived in Macedonia, but in Macedonia he was troubled on every side. Outside he had conflicts. Inside he had fears. And he was very comforted and encouraged by the coming of Titus, not just because Titus was a refreshment to him. Titus was good company, somebody who reminded him of things he needed to know, and somebody who just bolstered his spirit by being close by, although that's also certainly true. But Titus also encouraged him because he had good news from Corinth. And the good news from Corinth is that the Corinthians were very sorry. Now, there's a couple of different layers to that. And that's where we pick up today in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8, where Paul says, "For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a while. Now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that your sorrow led to repentance." Let's stop there in the middle of verse 9 for right now. There's a couple of things to notice there. One, we did already point out last week that Paul experienced misgivings or second thoughts or regret over the letter that he sent to them. Now, it's interesting that Paul is having second guessing over what he sent when what he sent was inspired. That is maybe not something we would have expected, but it shows the genuine humanity of the apostle, as well as the fact that the reality or the process of inspiration doesn't take away from the humanity of the people that God is using to write those inspired scriptures. When Paul experienced those misgivings, as pointed out last week, it sort of clues us in and lets us know that when there are conflicts and tensions and suspicions, it's very normal to have heightened anxiety about it, to be concerned, to wonder if Maybe we said too much. Maybe we said too little. Maybe we said the wrong thing. Maybe we said it in the wrong way. Maybe we said it to the wrong person. There's all kinds of regrets that you can absolutely be experiencing. And I think one of the things to learn from Paul's example here is that that's normal. To some degree, it goes with the territory. Conflict is confusing, and the odds that uninspired we are going to get everything right when Paul had misgivings are very small. And even if by some miracle we did get everything right, that wouldn't guarantee that you would have no misgivings. That wouldn't guarantee that you'd be well pleased with a good day's work after engaging in conflict or controversy. The fact is that it is difficult as well as confusing. It's very easy to be tempted into extremes in more than one direction. It's very easy to give way to the flesh or to give place to the devil. And so the idea that we'll emerge from conflict very well satisfied with ourselves, I don't think that's realistic. And if we do, that might almost be more of a danger sign because it could just mean that we're wildly unself aware, not very attuned to how we may have come across over the course of a particular conflict. But Paul had moved from regretting having made them sorry to no longer regretting it. And that wasn't because Paul had become more of a jerk over the intervening time frame. It was because the sorrow of the Corinthians, the sorrow that Paul caused them, had had a good result, had been handled in a godly way. And so that brings us, in a sense, to the main theme of 2 Corinthians 7, at least verses 8 through 12, which in a sense you could characterize or describe as the value of discomfort. When is it worthwhile for somebody to upset us? Many times we can be tempted to think that if something is going to upset people, it's not worth doing. That's not true. What Paul did upset the Corinthians. After they got his letter, they weren't as happy as they were before they got it. And yet it was worth it. Now, the moment we say that, of course, it's also important to qualify that. It's also important to point out the danger on the other extreme. Because it's sometimes worthwhile for people to be upset does not mean that we're guaranteed to be doing something worthwhile just because we're upsetting other people. In other words, we can't embrace one half of Paul's example. We have to embrace both halves of it, or we're really not getting the benefit that is available for us here. So if you are happy because of the great numbers of people that you upset over the course of a given day, I don't really think you're following Paul's example, because he did regret having made them sorry with his letter. That wasn't easy. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't something he thought, oh good, let me do that again tomorrow. But he also didn't say, let me make sure never to upset anyone ever again, because that was terrible. It was terrible. It was no fun for him. But when he got the good report from Titus, he could see that there was a real value to that. So we need to embrace both parts of Paul's example. We need to accept the fact that upsetting other people isn't fun and shouldn't be fun. If we find that fun, there's a serious problem with us, whatever else may be going on with other people. But the other side of that is that it's also not legitimate to conclude that it's always wrong to upset people, that there is no value in discomfort. Paul tells us the opposite of that to be true here. So how do you hold those two things together? How do you embrace both parts of Paul's example? Well, you need not to take emotions, whether your own or somebody else's, as being the criterion of what is acceptable, what is worthwhile, what is it responsible to do. We can't be held hostage to our emotions or to the emotions of others. Those are not the guidelines for how we know we're doing the right thing. It would be much safer to follow Paul's example and continue to speak the truth out of genuine affection, out of genuine vulnerability in many ways, even if people don't have a particularly good reaction to that. In order to embrace both sides of Paul's example, in other words, the major question can't be, does this cause discomfort? Because causing discomfort is not fun, that shouldn't be the goal, but nor is avoiding causing all discomfort the goal. That's not how we can be approved before God and approve ourselves in our own consciences. So we need to not look at feelings as the number one, at least, criterion for whether something is or is not the right thing to do. Then it's also important to add that we should embrace Paul's example in two ways. There's two sides to that example, and we need to embrace both of those. But then the example itself needs to be embraced in more ways than one. In other words, sometimes we might be in the position of the Corinthians, and somebody else is saying things to us that are upsetting, that are perturbing. We go home and those words stick in our minds, and maybe we have trouble sleeping that night. And then sometimes it's the other way around. We're in a position where it seems like we are genuinely called upon by God to say something, and it's not easy, and maybe it doesn't go well. And maybe we also, in that situation, go home and toss and turn quite a bit, because there can be so much concern, so much personal perturbation about that. Well, what does it mean then to embrace both sides of that example? Well, it means embracing, on the one hand, that sometimes the truth is upsetting to people. But if the truth upsets them temporarily and in the long run leads to something better, then that's worth it. And for ourselves, maybe somebody says something to us and our initial reaction isn't great. Maybe we don't like it, maybe we're cold, maybe we're hot, maybe we're any one of a variety of reactions that show displeasure or discomfort. That doesn't mean we can't go away and think about it and come to a better frame of mind. You're not locked in to sticking with whatever your initial reaction was. So in order to embrace this, in order to persuade ourselves that there's a value in discomfort, whether it's being caused to us or whether we're causing it to others, as long as we're approaching this with a godly mindset, let's read what happened with the Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 7, verse 9, and then beginning in the middle of the verse, Paul says, "For you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer loss from us in nothing. For godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation, not to be regretted. But the sorrow of the world produces death." Now that part is also very significant because there's an encouragement and there's a warning about it. Hurt feelings are obviously no fun, and they're not good in and of themselves. And in fact, Paul says that they can be tremendously destructive. The sorrow of the world leads to death. But when there's godly sorrow that leads to repentance, then that is actually a glorious thing. Then whatever upset we experienced wasn't for our destruction, rather it led to salvation. They suffered loss from Paul in nothing, even though he upset them, even though he hurt their feelings, because It brought them around to where they needed to be in their relationship with God. Well, that is a glorious goal to keep in mind for ourselves when our feelings are hurt, to keep in mind when we feel that we have to say something and we know that we run the risk of upsetting somebody. That's not fun, and you shouldn't want to do it for that reason, but so that they suffer loss in nothing, so that repentance leads to salvation. Well, now that's genuinely more loving than refusing to say something because somebody might get upset. And you notice how Paul expands on that thought. For observe, verse 11, for observe this very thing, that you sorrowed in a godly manner. And what happened because they sorrowed in a godly manner? What diligence it produced in you, what clearing of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what vehement desire, what zeal, what vindication. You notice how he heaps up all of these different words to commend their response to this sorrow that they had experienced. It produced a significant change. If before they'd been kind of idle or slack, now they were diligent. If before questions were raised about them, now those questions were cleared up by their new conduct. And on he goes through the list. In all things, you proved yourselves to be clear in this matter. Therefore, although I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of him who had done the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. Here, Paul tells them why he wrote them as he did. He wrote them so that his care for them in the sight of God might appear. So there's the third part of the triangle, if you will, of Paul's example in speaking difficult truths to Christians with whom he was in conflict. You have the side that did lead to anxiety, that did lead to second guessing because he didn't enjoy upsetting them. You have the side that he faithfully told them the truth, even though, of course, there was that very real danger that they would be sorry. And then you have the reality that he did so in love. Well, in order to learn and to profit from Paul's example, we need to embrace those three sides of this triangle. And we also need to understand that sometimes we'll be in Paul's position, sometimes we'll be in the position of the Corinthians. Neither one is particularly fun, but when we approach whatever the specifics are, when we approach it in a godly way, it can actually lead to something wonderful and glorious. Once again, I've used up the time that I have allotted to myself, and so we will have to revisit 2 Corinthians at least one more time before we're quite done with the question of the epistolary example of Paul as we find it in 2 Corinthians. Until next time, God bless you.